The air that night carried the weight of magnolia and damp cotton, as if the land itself had wrapped a shawl against some remembered cold. Lanterns hung from the piazza of Magnolia Grove, their flames trembling in a wind that moved like a thought across the rows of planted stalks. Far off, the chapel bell, small, trustworthy, began its carol of iron and echo, counting down the hours to midnight with the same steady patience it had when fathers and sons had bent knees beneath its timber for decades. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The fields held their breath. If you value stories that keep memory from being swallowed by time, stay with this one until the end, subscribe and like to help keep such names from being forgotten. Magnolia Grove was a house of boards and white paint that knew how to look like a godly place to visitors and financiers. Its columns caught the sun and held it until evening. Its dining table could seat 30 and had taken 2 generations of plates bearing roast and cider and the small politics of place. The household ran by a kind of tacit choreography. The colonel in his parlor with a ledger, the mistress in her parlors and prayers, the heir attending to hunting and the occasional law book, the overseer walking the lines where the whip and the ledger met. Beneath and behind the house sat the slave quarters, rows of rough clapboard and packed earth, a world of its own where work and song and sorrow threaded together under the scrape of moonlight. Lila moved in both worlds the way a seamstress moves between 2 fabrics. Pressed against one, mended in the other. She was small and quick-fingered, with hands that felt the grain of wood and the thread of linen differently from most in the house. She could fold a napkin into a swan that would make a visiting lady smile, and she could peel an apple so thin the curl looked like lace. Children in the quarters said she carried the smell of the kitchen in the hollows of her arms. Sage and vinegar, boiling potatoes, and the faint, stubborn sweetness of molasses. To the house she was called house girl or girl in tones that never learned her full name. To some children she was Aunt Lila, though she had no true aunthood to claim. In the long, crooked ledger of the place she had been entered as property the day she was born. In the unrecorded ledger that lived under her breast, she kept a different account, a small notary of things owed, names that were not hers, and a weight of things that might not be repaid. Her mother, Mary, known in the quarters as Ma'am Mary, had raised Lila by the hearth until the cough took her in the spring. People said the colonel had been ill with a horse once and had called upon Ma'am Mary for nursing. Later, when Lila was a slip of a girl, whispers threaded through the quarters that there was more than caregiving in those days, that sometimes the colonel's shadow was long, and that small bodies left traces in silence. The week before Christmas, Lila learned that her youngest kin, Jonah, was to be sold downriver to make room for a mortgage payment. The word lodged in her like a splinter. There were other reckonings. One night, 2 weeks before the feast, Thomas had come to the kitchen in his boots, smelling of stables and whiskey, his voice a leisure of ownership. Something in his eyes when he looked at Lila was a claim that kept no respect for her mother or her humanity. He laughed at a joke he told to no one in particular, and put out a hand as if to test a commodity. Ruth watched him across the hearth and did not speak, because words in that moment were like setting a bird free into storm. Lila felt, in the soft of that humiliation, an old pain rise, An ache like water held and held until it grew heavy enough to spill. How to make a story of a single action without making it a solitary event? The poison, if poison is what the world calls it, took shape not as an idea seized in a flash, but as a composition of small availabilities. Lila had seen the colonel keep a tin of coarse saltpeter for preserving hides and another jar of rat sweet labeled by someone who had come through the house and called it by that practical name. She had, under Ruth's hand, learned that certain roots would dull the pulse and confuse the sleep. A person who keeps lists of wrongs knows also the names of remedies. There is a terrible intimacy in that balance. On the day before Christmas, while the house prepared, tablecloths starching in the yard, candles trimmed to burn long, Lila took a single measured pinch from a jar no one thought to lock. She did not shout a manifesto. She worked with patience like a seamstress, pressing a hidden stitch into the fabric of what would be served. The night of the feast moved as a practiced prayer. The parlor lights shone like captive stars. Plates clinked. Fire licked the hearth. Music from the chapel floated through the panes. Thomas ate with unwatched appetite. His sister Eleanor, adept at gentility, kept the conversation polished. The slaves served with the steadiness of those who had learned to make service itself visible and discreet. Lila moved behind screens and chairs, a shadow with the deftness of hands born to making and mending. At the center of the table, the colonel raised his glass and spoke words about providence and family and the sweet obligations of stewardship. His voice carried the same firmness he used when signing away acres. He spoke of the future and of the heir who would hold the keys to land and ledger. Someone clapped too loudly, and a glass caught the firelight and made a small comet across the linen. Lila felt the heat climb her spine. Then, in a moment at once ordinary and irrevocable, the cup that Tavish, an old gardener who had a limp and a hand that always smelled of earth, was there. Thomas drank. The wine was thick that season. It rested in the throat like velvet. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed changed. Conversation hovered. The colonel's smile remained like a coin pressed to a book. Minutes later, Thomas laughed and coughed, color leaving his face like bloom from a pressed flower. He reached for the table and then for his chest, a movement of surprise, of betrayal. The room went heavy as if someone had closed a lid on the air. The colonel's voice snapped from steady to sharp. "What is this?" he demanded. Thomas's eyes were strange, wider than they should have been, then pinched, and he tried to stand and could not. Panic moved through the house like a whetstone across knives. The colonel barked a dozen orders. The overseer's boots thudded on the boards. Ruth pushed past silk and cloth and toward the kitchen with the speed of a woman whose years had taught her the short, sharp language of emergencies. Someone ran to the yard for the young doctor, who kept a satchel and the bitter, stoic face of a man who wore suspicion like a cloak. The slave quarters watched, but remained where they were told to watch. Power moves in strict geometry, and even smoke cannot cross those lines in a night. Thomas did not recover. He vomited and then went quiet, his breath a shudder in his chest that left a sound like a bell muffled in wool. The doctor, a visitor from the town with hands that smelled of ink and wine, felt Thomas's pulse and frowned, and then said aloud what, in other times, had been a private dread. "Poison," he said. The word a flat stone dropped into a dark pool. The house moved into accusation, like a mouth moving into a bite. fingers pointed toward the quarters, because that is often the way men who hold nothing more than coin and title keep sense of their world, by naming those beneath them guilty. The colonel's face went a color that did not suit him. The ledger of his temper was paid now in rage. He ordered the overseer to fetch those who had been near the table, to halt the kitchen, to pry open drawers, to search in the name of security. The overseer came with a rope and a terrible economy of small practiced cruelties. Lila, when she was taken from behind the steaming kettle and pressed before the master's anger, had a sort of cold certainty. She did not have the marks of frenzy. There was no trembling in her hands beyond the ordinary chastened tremor of those who bear the weight of keeping children safe. She stood in the parlor with the iron light falling on her shoulders and watched the colonel and his circle of men with a gaze that had learned to measure fate. Her mind was a quiet room where decision sat like furniture. In that space, she remembered Jonah's face, the two silences of Thomas's laugh, the jar in the pantry, Ruth's hand on her wrist. She thought of the oak by the lane, how it had shed a leaf on the day Ma'am Mary had died, as if the earth itself were noting the ledger. The colonel demanded confession, and at first got not that. Leela's voice was small. It was not always heard, even when she spoke. The overseer pulled at her sleeve like a man arranging cloth for a public show. They asked her if she had poisoned Thomas. Someone suggested it was the work of abolitionists or the enemy abroad sending pamphlets and practices to sully their beds. There were eyes that looked to Savannah for culprits, to the river for the moving, restless hand of the world that might unsettle plantation calm. Rumors are a kind of net. They catch anything that flies too far from the nest of entitlement. When Leela answered, she chose truth. She told them that she had put a bitter in the cup, that she had taken it from a place where the colonel thought a woman would not look, that she had thought, then murmured her reasons not as a plea, but as an account. Her words were not a speech meant for jury or pulpit. They were small and precise and terrible in their simplicity. She said Jonah's name. She said that Thomas had laughed at the thought of Jonah being gone. She said the colonel had never once looked her full in the face, and that his ledger read the flesh that bore his reckoning, but never his name. The parlor went still. The colonel's face hardened like bread left in sun. "You dare name me so?" he asked, not quite able to consume the audacity. "I named who I had to," Leela said. There was no triumph in it. There was instead a kind of weary arithmetic of sorrow. What followed was a choreography practiced by those who keep order by breaking bodies. The overseer took Leela and bound her wrists for the house to see. They wanted a spectacle that restored their geometry. They stripped her of any pretense of respect and forced her to the yard, where the men gathered like a parliament of small violences. They asked the same questions and repeated them louder, as if volume might fetch a different truth. The colonel watched with a face carved into something like stone, and then, when the questions threatened to break into the sort of doubt that might implicate him, he ordered a punishment that made men look away. He was a man trained by titles to be decisive. He chose the instrument of example, something public that would quiet not merely the body, but the thought of dissent. Ruth tried to stand between them and Leela. Old hands that had pressed poultices and counted births into the night moved toward the line of violence. Her voice, which had been a soft, remonstrative language in the kitchen for decades, raised and cracked. "Let her be," Ruth said, meaning more than the word could hold. "She is ours, as all of them are, but not hatched in your ledger." The colonel's daughter, Eleanor, watched from the side. Her habit had been one of gentility, and her life had been a geography of drawing rooms and piano benches. Yet there was a softness in her that could not turn away. She had seen Leela fold napkins with the kindness of someone who also folded small sorrows into pockets. The sight of the hands bound and the eyes facing the sky did something to her that might unmake complicity later. For now, she did the gentlest violence a daughter can. She stayed, silent and watching, while her father's command moved like a blade. They set upon Lila with a punishment meant to mark. It was not of the ugliest imagination that men could devise. No detailed mutilation was ever described later in the ways that sensationalist tongues might have it. But there were scars exacted, an economy of pain that left a person altered in ways the law could not fully enumerate. They cut her away from the house's table, from the right to move inside parlor and pantry. They declared her an example. She was not publicly executed. Death would have been too neat a closure for men who feared their ledger and wanted the slow lesson. Instead, she was bound and made to sleep in the yard beneath the oak, where the house servants left offerings for rains, a place of both shame and the original community. As the first snow, rare and pale in those latitudes, fell the next week, it seemed to lay a soft, indifferent veil over what had happened. The house moved on in grooves of survival. The colonel buried his grief for the heir in more ledgers. He hired a doctor from Savannah who could speak of toxin and treatment in professional terms. He ordered a small private mourning that kept the public shape of grief neat. The town talked in low tones, the sort of speech that preserves its own prudence by naming the misdeed in ways that allowed it to feel safe. In the quarters, however, the event refracted into 1,000 other things. Lila's act, call it murder, call it resistance, became a story told by firelight and by the steady rhythm of looms. Mothers told their children of her, in the same breath they told them to keep their heads down and to look for the chance to run. A song grew, a small, simple refrain that folded grief into memory. The name of a girl and the winter cup. The song traveled like a root beneath and across fences, gathering leaves of truth as it went. It told of sorrow and also of the claim someone made when the law refused to own its debts. Eleanor Whitmore, the colonel's daughter, kept a different kind of record. She tucked away a small folding note that Lila had once given her. A scrap of starch-stiffened linen with a child's pencil scrawl that read for Jonah, and at night she would press the paper to her face. She did not speak of it, not in the house where loyalty to father and ledger was the measure of honor. Yet the note became a tiny rebellion in the shape of a paper, something she could keep and look upon when she needed to remember that the world was not solely what the ledger said. When the colonel ordered certain sales, Eleanor's face would go pale, and she would find a way to slip a coin into a palm, or to let a man have a job mending something. She would, in small acts, perform a contraband mercy. At night, she would walk to the oak and press her palm to its trunk and feel the roughness of bark, as if it were an old companion. The tree had watched births and deaths and measured the slow erosion of families. It had kept a ledger of weather that no human hand could dispute. She told the tree nothing it did not already know. Rumors traveled beyond the county. A sheet printed in Savannah, ragged and eager, ran a small piece about the death of a plantation heir, couched in language that never touched what had really happened, but hinted at unrest. Men in distant towns who had never tasted the kitchen smoke or the weight of a rope read about things like crime and poison, as if such matters could be separated from the house that birthed them. From the vantage of the quarters, these papers were the chatter of men who would not drink the broth that had swallowed their kin. Time, in the way it folds into a place, began to do a strange thing. The story of Lila became both legend and ledger. In the house, it was a breach to be addressed quietly. In the quarters, it was a hymn of sorrow and courage. When children were born and later told of that winter cup, their stories shifted in tone, as stories do. Some made Lila a monster, others a saint, but most kept her as a woman who had chosen a hard truth because nothing softer had ever been offered. Eleanor, who had kept the note pressed to her skin, left the house 2 years later to marry a man from the coast. She did not take the white-pillared rooms with her wholly. She left an empty chair in the parlor and tucked the note among linens she took with her. She told no one of it, but stories move like water, seeping through cracks, and in time word of her small acts of mercy, loans of grain, quiet employment for men with the stamina to work at sea, traveled back to the quarters as if news were its own currency. The colonel grew older and more brittle, his anger a fossil of the vigor he had once wielded. He signed papers and walked with a cane, and sometimes sat by the hearth and watched the house as if it were a painting that had betrayed him. In the years that followed, Lila's name was inscribed in songs, in whispers at fairs, in the corners of journals kept by women who thought they kept nothing but gardens. People in the quarters made a small shrine by the oak, a cracked cup, a scrap of cloth, a carved initial. They did not call it a monument of blame. They called it a remembering. Parents taught their children to remember what had been done to them, lest the ledger be rewritten in polite ink and forget to list the losses. What the house called scandal, the quarters called memory. Memory holds names that law does not. Memory keeps the ledger that cannot be purchased or sold. It is a stubborn thing.
She, in a small measures, tried to make good what she could. She did not perform miracles, but she loaned money to a man in the quarters to keep him from being sold. She found room for a child who might otherwise have been bartered. Such gestures do not erase a crime. They keep a memory alive with a tender hand. As for Lila, the truth of her final days, if truth is a single thing, remains shrouded by the slow fog of rumor and the quiet courage of those who choose to protect those they love by silence. Some said she went north and lived under a new name, teaching children to read and to hide names in the seams of quilts. Some said she was sold and died with her hands folded, refusing to tell. The only certainty was the way people remembered her. A woman who had, on a slow winter night, made a choice and then became, in memory, more than the story of that choice. The oak by Magnolia Grove stood for many years, and beneath its branches people left their secrets and their small votive things. When the land finally shifted hands and the house that once looked like a godly place fell into the slow rot of weather and neglect, the oak remained a witness. Visitors years later, children with no ledger to consult, men going home from town, would walk by the ruins and sometimes find a stone with carved initials or a cup tucked into a cleft. And they would tell one another, in tones that had the hushed respect of confession, that once a girl had stood and let the world know what she thought its balance owed. Stories have a way of asking those who listen to decide what they will keep. To remember, after all, is to choose not to let the easy ledger stand. It is to name that there was a woman who worked between kitchens and fields, who learned from an old woman's mortar and pressed a bitter into a cup, who acted not from madness, but from an accumulation of injuries. It is to hold the contradiction, that her act could both wound and be a wound laid bare, that justice and vengeance often travel together, and the hearts of those left behind are a messy business. On Christmas nights after that first one, when the wind moved across the ruined porches, and the chapel's bell sometimes rang, though no congregation gathered beneath it, people in the surrounding hills would hear a sound like a low song broken on the wind. Whether that song was Lila's, or the land's, or the oak's, no one could say for certain. But when the wind took the sound and carried it down the lane, the memory of what had been done and the lives altered by it would come with it, like an unwelcome guest that insists on being seen. The house might forget its wrongs when ledgers balanced, and men might write their names with flourish in the margins of local histories, but the quarters kept their hymns. They stitched the story into cloth and told it to children, and in that way Lila's act remained alive, not as a tidy moral, but as a reckoning. The oak kept its leaves, and the wind kept its story.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era It. Mara planned to return the cup to the oak. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. She thought of leaving it in the quarters where it might be honored, but something in her wanted the offering to be outward-facing, placed where anyone passing might see that the story belonged not only to those who had suffered, but to the road itself. She set out before dawn, with the quilt rolled and the cup wrapped in a scrap of cloth, because mornings were the only time the lane felt entirely to herself, and because the wind then was honest and sharp. She walked through fields that had once been lined with the colonel's hedges and now grew wild with clover. The house, such as remained, showed windows darkened, porches sagging like exhausted shoulders. The oak rose like an old sentinel, its trunk knotted and thick with years. Children still scrawled initials into its bark, but the deeper marks had been tended by hands that remembered to keep them free of rot. As Mara approached, the long grass breathed low, and the first white of frost rimed the cup in its cloth. She sat beneath the oak, the quilt unrolled across her knees. She arranged the cup upon a square of fabric, smoothed its face with the back of her hand, as one might smooth the brow of someone sleeping. For a long while she said nothing. She only listened, to a distant crow, to the faint clang of a smith at his forge, to the whisper of leaves. At last she spoke, first to no one in particular, then to the quiet of the place that had held so much. "To you who stood," she said, and the words were more breath than accusation. "To you who chose, to the hands that washed and the hands that hid, to the ledger that could never hold marrow, we carry you." She thought of Eleanor, who had kept a scrap of paper and small kindnesses, of men who died with their accounts diminished by time and poor choices, of women who stitched names into quilts and would not let the story be simplified. Mara's voice was not loud, it need not be. What it asked was not punishment, but acknowledgement. She lifted the cup and set it into a cleft in the oak's roots, where two old roots curved like arms holding a cradle. The cup fit as if made for that hollow. She placed the quilt atop it, a thin, careful covering, and then smoothed the fabric with hands that trembled only a little. Then she dug a shallow trench with a fist and set a stone upon it, small, unmarked, but placed with intent. She whispered each name she had ever heard associated with the story: Thomas, Lila, Eleanor, the Colonel, and then some who had never been named at all. It was not a prayer of absolution, but of remembrance. It did not absolve, nor did it punish. It kept. It was, she knew, a form of justice peculiar to the living, insistence that certain things remain in the light. When she rose, the wind came to meet her, carrying a thin, broken song, as if the oak itself harmonized. Mara did not pretend the action would clear accounts or wash away the ache. She understood that a cup, a quilt, a carved initial, a hymn, all these were modest means.
But modest means, stitched together and handed down, altered worlds as surely as a single ledger line could not. Memory, she believed, when tended, was a working thing. It could be used to measure wrongs, to make room, to refuse easy forgetting. The courter continued to visit the oak. Sometimes they stood in small groups and shared bread. Sometimes they left a coin, a thimble, a scrap of paper with a name. Children who had never seen the house and who could trace no family line to the Colonel still learned the odd hymn and the small history of how a woman's choice had become a common teaching. The oak did not speak, but it kept. Leaves fell and gathered like notes. Years after Mara's offering, a child, no more than 8, ran to the oak and found the cup half covered by lichen and quilted cloth, its metal dulled but dignified. The child pressed a hand to it and then looked up at the adults who stood nearby. They told the story not as a moral to be recited coldly, but as a thing to hold. Sometimes people do harm. Sometimes harm is answered. Sometimes answers do not tidy the world, but remind it that mercy and witness must live together. The child listened, then added solemnly a small stone to the clearing, and the oak received it with the indifference of age and the tenderness of witness. The house that had once pretended piety and balance continued its slow decline. Men who wrote themselves large in town histories remained in those pages with sheen, but beyond the polished margins, the courter's hymn endured. Lila's fate remained, as it had from the beginning, a choice. Rumor and silence braided into one another, leaving no single strand to claim. The cup sat beneath the oak not to resolve that uncertainty, but to insist that uncertainty itself be held. And when the wind came at night, on those cold evenings when the bell tolled though no congregation gathered beneath it, the song rose again, some days more like a call to remembrance, other days like a lullaby for the wronged. It was neither accusation nor absolution. It was what the houses could not be, a patient, continuing witness. In that witness, the community found, awkwardly and with small triumphs, a form of justice that did not erase, but kept alive the truth that people had been seen.
that hands had labored for the living and the dead, and that the counting of years need not be the only accounting. The oak kept its leaves, the lane kept its names, and the cup, warmed once more by hands that refused to let its story be simplified, rested in the hollow, a small, honest altar to the complicated work of memory.